My daughter Vanessa stood at the podium of her own hospital gala, lifted her champagne toward 400 of the most important people in the city, and called me a charity case in front of every single one of them. She said it with a smile, the way you say a thing you have rehearsed, and the room laughed softly the way well-dressed people laugh when they are not sure whether something is a joke. I was sitting at a table 19 near the kitchen doors, where they seat the relatives nobody is supposed to photograph. I had a glass of water I had not touched, and a small oxblood leather portfolio resting on my lap, the kind with a little gold compass rose pressed into the corner. And inside that portfolio was the one piece of paper that was going to change the temperature of that entire ballroom before the night was over. My name is Lorraine Maddox. I am 64 years old. I buried my husband Cornelius 2 springs ago. And what my daughter did not know, what nobody under those chandeliers knew, was that the wing she was being honored for that evening had been paid for, every brick and every beam of it, by a fund I controlled with my own signature. She thought she was thanking strangers. She was thanking me. But before I tell you what happened when the donor list was read aloud, I want to ask you something, because I think some of you already know the shape of this story in your own bones. Have you ever been made small by the very person you spent your life lifting up? If you have, stay with me, because this is a story about what it costs to be invisible and what it is worth when the lights finally find you. Let me go back, though, because a reckoning means nothing if you do not understand the wound it answers. I was born in a town in the low country of South Carolina that does not appear on the kind of map people frame. The youngest of 6 in a house my grandmother kept warm with a wood stove, and a stubbornness that I did not appreciate until I had to grow my own. We lived at the end of a road that turned to mud when it rained and to dust when it did not, in a house my great-grandfather had built with his own hands out of pine he felled himself. 3 rooms and a porch and a tin roof that sang when the storms came off the water. There were 8 of us in those 3 rooms, my parents and my grandmother and 6 children. And I did not know until I was nearly grown that we were considered poor, because in that house I was never once made to feel that I was poor in anything that mattered. My mother cleaned other people's homes. I want to say that plainly and let it sit, because for most of my childhood I did not understand the size of what she did. She rose before the sun, and she put on a clean pressed uniform, and she walked or rode to the big houses on the other side of town, the houses with the white columns, and she scrubbed their floors and washed their windows and raised, in many cases, their children. And then she came home in the dark and raised her own. And she never once, in all the years I watched her, came through our door with the tiredness showing on her face. She put it down somewhere on the road, between their house and ours, the tiredness, and she came in singing. I asked her once, when I was older and angrier, how she could bear it, cleaning up after people who looked through her. And she said a thing I did not understand for 40 years. She said, "Baby, they think they are paying me to be invisible. But I see everything in those houses. I know which marriages are cold and which children are hungry for a kind word, and which of those fine people cannot sleep at night. Being unseen is not the same as being blind. Being unseen," she said, "is a kind of power, if you can keep it from turning into a cage. A kind of power, if you can keep it from turning into a cage." I have spent my whole life learning the second half of that sentence. If you have made it this far into my story, and you feel that old ache, the ache of the one who gives everything and is allowed to keep nothing but the giving, then I want you to do one small thing for me before I go on. Subscribe to this channel, Her Quiet Reckoning. Because everything we tell here is for the women the world decided to look straight through. The mothers and wives and daughters who built the whole house and were handed the smallest chair in it. This is the place where the quiet ones finally get the floor. What I am about to tell you is the part I have waited 2 years to say out loud. And I would rather say it to people who know in their own bones why it matters. My father laid brick. He was a big, quiet man with hands that were always healing from one small wound or another. And he built half the chimneys and walkways and garden walls in that county. Beautiful work, work that is standing to this day, work that bears no name. Nobody drives past a brick wall and wonders who laid it. He knew that, and it did not trouble him. Or if it did, he never let us see it. And on Sundays, he wore a suit that was 20 years old and pressed to a knife's edge. And he sat in the third pew of a small brick church, a church with walls he himself had repaired for free. And he sang in a low voice that I can still hear. And he taught me, without ever once sitting me down to teach me, that a man can build a whole city and ask for nothing, and that the building is the thanks. And over all of us, the queen of those 3 rooms, was my grandmother. She had been born to people who had been born into bondage, and she carried that the way you carry a thing that is too heavy to set down and too sacred to complain about. In her back, in her hands, in the iron of her. She kept the wood stove going, and she kept the family going, and she kept, in a tin box on the highest shelf, a ledger. A real one, a little notebook with a marbled cover, in which she wrote down every kindness our family ever gave, and every kindness we ever received. Not the money. She did not care about the money, but the deeds. Who brought soup when the baby was sick, who sat up with whom, what we owed, and to whom in the only currency she believed in. And she would say, tapping that little book with one strong finger, "The Lord keeps a ledger too, child, a bigger one than mine. And he writes down everything, the cruelty and the kindness both, and one day he reads it out loud. And on that day, the last shall be first. You work quietly. You give quietly. You let God keep the ledger." And one day they said, "In that house, the last shall be first." I believe that. I am 64 years old, and I am here to tell you that I still believe it. Though I have learned that sometimes the Lord arranges for the ledger to be read out loud, and he does not always wait until heaven to do it. Sometimes he arranges for it to be read under a gold leaf ceiling by the very person the ledger has been keeping safe. I met Cornelius Maddox when I was 22 and selling notions behind a counter in Charleston in a dry goods store on a street that smelled of salt and horses. And he came in 3 times in 1 week to buy thread he did not need. He bought white thread on Monday and black thread on Wednesday, and on Friday he stood at my counter turning a spool of blue in his big, careful hands for so long that I finally asked him, plainly, whether he was opening a tailor's shop, because no man buys that much thread he is not sewing with. And he looked at me with the steadiest brown eyes I had ever seen, and he said, "No, ma'am. I am not sewing anything. I am working up the courage to ask if I might walk you home." I had been asked that question by a dozen smoother men, and I had said no to all of them. And I do not to this day know why I said yes to the one who could not even invent a better reason to be at my counter than thread. But I have come to believe that the Lord, who keeps the ledger, also keeps the appointments, and that some doors open in your life the moment the right person stops pretending and tells you the truth. He was a tall, unhurried man with a careful voice and hands that had done real work. And he told me on our second walk, down by the water with the gulls going over, that he intended to build something that would outlast him. I thought he meant a house. He meant a life. He had grown up the way I had, in a family that built and fixed and asked for nothing. And he had a thing in him that I recognized because my father had it. A quietness that was not weakness, but the opposite of weakness. The stillness of a man who knows exactly what he can do and feels no need to announce it to anyone who has not asked. We courted for a year. He never raised his voice. He never once told me what I would do. He asked me what I thought, and then he listened to the answer as though it were the most important thing he would hear that day. And I will tell you, of all the things that man gave me over 40 years, and he gave me a fortune, that listening was the richest. We married in a small brick church with the windows open, my father's church, and my grandmother sat in the front pew with her little marbled ledger in her purse. And we were poor in the way that does not feel poor when you are young and in love, and certain that the two of you together are smarter than the whole world. He had a mind for machines. He could take apart a thing that was broken and understand not just how it failed, but why it was ever going to fail. And in 1974, he started a small company out of a rented garage that repaired and then, eventually, redesigned the cooling systems that big buildings use. The unglamorous guts of hospitals and schools and office towers that nobody thinks about until the day they stop working. He started with one truck, a second-hand set of tools, and $340 that we had saved in a coffee can. And I remember the night before he opened, the two of us in that cold garage with a single bare bulb hanging down, and he laid out the tools on a clean cloth the way a surgeon lays out instruments. And he said to me, "Lorraine, I can fix anything in this city that blows cold air. The only thing I cannot do is keep the books, because numbers move sideways in my head." And I said, "Then I will keep the books." And he looked at me, and something passed between us, and he said, "Then we are not a man with a company. We are a company." And we never, in 40 years, spoke of it any other way. I kept the books. I want you to hear that plainly, because it matters to everything that comes after. I did not bring him coffee. I kept the books. I negotiated the contracts. I learned the tax code at our kitchen table with a baby on my hip and a second one coming, reading the regulations out loud by lamplight until I understood them better than the accountants we could not yet afford to hire. I learned how a payroll works and how it fails. I learned how to read a contract for the clause that will ruin you, the one buried on the 4th page in language designed to be skipped. And I caught those clauses year after year, and I struck them out, and I initialed the margin, and I sent the contracts back. And the big firms on the other end learned, slowly, that the Maddox Company did not sign what it had not read. They did not know that the person reading was a young black woman at a kitchen table. They thought they were dealing with a careful lawyer. In a way, they were. I had made myself one, out of necessity and lamplight, because no one was going to do it for us. And when the bank would not lend to a black couple operating out of a garage, when Cornelius went down to the loan office in his pressed suit with his beautiful designs under his arm, and came home gray-faced and quiet, having been kept waiting 3 hours and then told no in under 5 minutes by a man who never looked up from his desk. It was my signature, my maiden name, Lorraine Cornelius, that opened the door. Because nobody on the other end of a letter knew what color the hand that signed it was. I wrote the letters. I made the applications. I signed myself L. Cornelius, the initial doing the same quiet work my mother's invisibility had done in the big houses. And the loans came through to L. Cornelius and Associates. And the associates were a man with a truck and a woman with a coffee can and a fierce, unbeautiful patience. We bought the second truck with that loan, then the third, then the building, a real building, with the company's name on it in letters that did not say my name at all. And I did not mind, because the lesson off the floor of my grandmother's house was that you do not announce your worth. You let it be discovered. And besides, I knew, I always knew. The knowing was enough then. It was not always going to be enough. But it was then. That is the first thing I need you to hold on to. The company that eventually made us wealthy, the company that quietly grew into something worth more than anyone who looked at our modest house would ever have guessed, was built on two names, and one of them was mine. And the bank that would not lend to my husband's face lent to my hidden hand. And I have thought, in the years since, about how much of my life has been spent being the hidden hand, and how the very thing that made me useful, the not being seen, was the thing that very nearly buried me alive. Vanessa was our second child and our only daughter, and she came into the world the way she would move through it, quickly and loudly, and certain that the room had been waiting for her. We had our son Marcus first, a gentle, slow-smiling boy who took after his father, who could sit for an hour watching his daddy's hands work and never need to be entertained. And then, 3 years later, Vanessa, who took after no one we could name. A child so bright and so hungry for the world's approval that I sometimes felt I was raising a small fire, and my only job was to keep her from burning down the people who loved her. I want to tell you about Marcus, because he is in this story, even when he is not on the stage, and because a mother who tells you only about the child who wounded her is not telling you the truth about her own heart. Marcus was the kind of child the world does not make a fuss over and should. He was not the fastest or the loudest. He brought home steady, unremarkable grades and a series of small, wounded animals. And he grew up into a steady, unremarkable, deeply good man who took over a hardware store in a town 2 hours from here and married a kind woman and raised 3 children who call me every Sunday without being reminded. He did not want his name on anything. When his father offered, years ago, to bring him into the company, Marcus thought about it for a week and then said gently that he did not think he was built to want what would have to be wanted to run a thing that big, and that he would rather fix lawn mowers and know his neighbors. Cornelius was disappointed for about a day and proud for the rest of his life. And I understood, because Marcus had inherited the deepest thing his father had, the thing under the genius for machines, which was the capacity to be content. Vanessa never inherited that. It is the one thing I could not give her, because you cannot give a child a thing by wanting it for them. And Lord knows I tried. I do not tell you that to turn you against her before you have met her. I loved that fire. I still love it. A mother does not get to choose to stop, but I would be lying if I said I did not see, even when she was small, that Vanessa measured a person by the size of the room they could fill, and that she had decided, somewhere very young, that her mother filled small rooms. We sent her to the best schools we could afford, and then to the best ones we could not. And I sat at that same kitchen table and moved numbers from one column to another so that she would never know how close the margins were. I want you to understand what that meant in the doing of it, because it is easy to say we paid for the best schools and let the sentence slide past you. There was a year when Vanessa was 15 and had set her heart on a boarding school 3 states away that cost more for 1 year than my father had earned in 10. And the company had had a hard season, and Cornelius and I sat at the table after the children were asleep and looked at the numbers, and there was no honest way to make them work. And then I found a way that was not quite honest, not to anyone but ourselves. I took the money we had set aside to finally fix the roof, and I took the money for a vacation we had promised ourselves for a decade. And I took a small loan against my own life insurance that I never told Cornelius about until years later. and I made the numbers work. And Vanessa went to that school, and the roof leaked into a bucket in the hall for 3 more winters, and she never knew. Because a bucket in the hall is the kind of thing a busy, ambitious girl does not see, and I did not point it out. Because the lesson off the floor of my grandmother's house was that you do not announce your worth. She wanted to be a doctor. She wanted, more specifically, to be an important doctor. The kind whose name goes on things, the kind who is introduced at dinners. And I was proud of her ambition, even on the nights it exhausted me, even on the nights it cost me a roof. I told myself that the wanting to be important was just the outer shell of wanting to do good, and that the shell would crack one day, and the good would be what was left. And I was right in the end. But it took a gold leaf ceiling to crack it. And I would not have chosen the method if I had been given the choice. Cornelius used to say she had inherited his drive, but not his patience. And that one day life would teach her the patience, and he hoped he would be there to see it soften her. He was not there to see it. That is one of the things I have had to forgive God for, slowly, over 2 years. And I am not finished. I think a part of why I did what I did at that gala, if I am being as honest with you as I am trying to be, is that I wanted to do for my daughter the thing her father had not lived long enough to do. I wanted to be there when life taught her the patience. I just did not expect that I would have to be the one to teach it. When Vanessa was in her residency, the recession came, and a great many small companies like ours did not survive it. Ours nearly did not. The contracts dried up the way a river dries up, not all at once, but in a slow falling. And one quarter we did the books, and the number at the bottom was red for the first time in 20 years. And I remember sitting at the table looking at that red number for a long time, and then getting up and making Cornelius his dinner and saying nothing, because he had enough to carry. There was a year, the year Vanessa was 26, when Cornelius and I quietly took out a second mortgage on the home his hands had helped build and put every dollar of it into the company to make payroll, because he could not bear to let go the men who had stayed with us for 30 years, men who had been at our wedding, men whose own children we had watched grow up, men named Earl and Theo and Big James who had come to us as young men and grown old, turning wrenches in our name. I worked the numbers 100 ways that year. I sat at the table until 2 and 3 in the morning, the same table, with a calculator and a yellow pad and a cup of coffee gone cold, trying to find the version of the arithmetic where we kept every man and kept the house and kept our pride. And there was no such version. There was only the second mortgage. And so we took it. I signed for it. My name, again, on the line that mattered. The line that put our home at risk to keep 112 families fed. And I signed it without my hand shaking. And I want you to know that of all the signatures of my life, the ones on the loans and the contracts, and later the great gifts, that is the one I am proudest of. The one that risked my own roof for other people's bread. We never told the children. You do not frighten your children with the weather inside your own house if you can help it. Marcus, 2 hours away with his hardware store, sensed something and called more often and asked no questions, which is its own kind of love. And Vanessa, in her residency in a city far away, learning to be important, called me one evening that exact year, the hardest year of our financial lives, the year of the bucket and the second mortgage and the red number, to say that she was embarrassed to bring her new fiancé to our home for Thanksgiving because the dining room wallpaper was peeling and the car in the driveway was 11 years old. I remember standing in that peeling dining room with the phone against my ear, looking at the table I had fed her at every day of her childhood. And I did not tell her that the reason the wallpaper was peeling was that her father and I had put the wallpaper money, and a great deal more than the wallpaper money, into keeping 112 families fed through a recession. I just said, "Of course, sweetheart. Why don't we meet at a restaurant? My treat, my treat." With money we did not have, because the lesson of my childhood was that you do not announce your worth. You let it be discovered. She married a man named Grant, a hospital administrator with a firm handshake and the particular confidence of someone who has never once been the smallest person in a room. I liked him at first. I want to be fair. He was good to her in the ways that were easy, and bad to us in the ways that were quiet. And it took me years to understand that he had looked at Cornelius and me over that first restaurant dinner and silently filed us under a heading he would never say out loud. The wife's parents, modest people, not a connection worth cultivating. We came through the recession. I will tell you how, because it matters. We came through it because the men stayed, and because the designs Cornelius had patented were so good that when the building boom came back, every contractor in 3 states wanted what only we could sell them, and the orders came in faster than we could fill them, and within 4 years the red number was a memory, and the second mortgage was paid off, and the company was worth more than it had ever been worth. We had bet the house on our own people and our own work, and the bet had come in. And it was right about then, when the company was strong and getting stronger, that the offers began. Cornelius sold the company 11 years ago. I want to tell you about that day because it is the hinge on which this whole story turns, and almost nobody alive knows the truth of it. A larger firm, a national one, had been circling our little company for years because Cornelius had patented 3 cooling designs that they could not get around and did not want to keep competing with. Their lawyers came in expensive suits and sat at a long table and slid papers across it. And on the first papers there was a number, and Cornelius looked at me, and I had read the contract the night before the way I read every contract, by lamplight, line by line, and I had found the clause on the 4th page that would have let them keep the patents and discard the man, and I had marked it. And so I shook my head, just slightly, the way 40 years had taught us both to read. And Cornelius said gently, "No." They came back. They made a much larger offer and a cleaner contract, and I read that one too. And the night before we signed, my husband and I sat up late at the kitchen table, the same table, and we did not talk about the money. We talked about Earl and Theo and Big James, and we made the new firm put it in writing that every one of our men would keep his job and his pension, and they agreed because they wanted the patents that badly, and only then, with our people protected, did we agree to sell. And on a Tuesday in October, in a lawyer's office downtown, with the autumn light coming gold through tall windows, my husband and I sold the company we had built in a garage for an amount of money that I am not going to say out loud, because the number is not the point, except to tell you that it was the kind of number that changes what a family is, if the family knows about it. I signed first. He had me sign first, that day, on purpose, and when I looked up at him, he had tears in his steady brown eyes, and he said low, so the lawyers would not hear, "You built this as much as I did, Lorraine, and I wanted your name on it first, just once, where I could see it." And then he signed under me, and the company that had been ours was ours no longer, and we were, the 2 of us, 2 people in our 50s from 3 rented rooms and a coffee can, suddenly and quietly rich beyond anything our parents could have dreamed. We did not tell the family. That was my decision as much as his. We sat in the car in the parking garage afterward, 2 people in their 50s who had just become wealthy beyond anything our parents could have imagined. and we did not feel like celebrating. We felt afraid. We had watched what money did to families. We had watched Cornelius's own brother tear their mother's funeral into a war over a house and a watch. And we made a promise to each other in that car, with the engine off and the concrete pressing in around us, that we would not let the number change how our children saw us, that we would not buy their love or their respect, and that we would give the money away in a way that did good and asked for nothing, not even a thank you. So we did something that I have never regretted, and that cost me more than I knew it would. We took the great bulk of that money and we put it into a fund. A donor-advised fund, the lawyers called it, a structure that lets you give to causes over time and, if you wish, give anonymously. We sat in the lawyer's office, the same office, a week after the sale, and the lawyer explained the structure to us, the way you can put money into such a fund and then, as the years go by, direct it out to the hospitals and the schools and the scholarships you choose, and how the law allows you, if you ask for it, to keep your name off every gift so that the good goes out and the giver stays hidden. And I felt something settle in me when he said that, because it was the shape of my whole life. The shape my mother had worn in the big houses and my father had worn at his beautiful nameless walls. The shape of giving everything and asking for nothing. And I thought, here, at last, is a way to do at the largest scale the thing I have always done at the smallest. I did not yet understand that a virtue carried too far, with no one ever allowed to see it, can hollow you out from the inside. We named it the Cornelius Fund, after my husband's first name, which was also my maiden name, so that the name on the giving would be true, and also tell no one anything. It was Cornelius's idea, the name, and he laughed when he thought of it. That quiet laugh. And he said, "This way, when they read it, they will think they are thanking me, and they will really be thanking you, and only you and I and the Lord will know the difference." He thought it was a fine joke between the two of us, a private tenderness, his way of putting my hidden name on the largest thing we would ever do. He could not have known how that joke would land 11 years later in a ballroom, off the lips of our own daughter, into the most important silence of my life. And we made one rule for ourselves, written into the founding documents in my own hand, because by then it had become my habit and my pride to be the signature nobody saw. Every gift would be anonymous, completely and permanently. And I, Lorraine Maddox, would be the sole trustee for as long as I lived, with the final and unshared say over every single dollar that ever left it. Not Cornelius and I jointly. Me. He insisted on that too. He said, "Your name opened every door we ever walked through, and I want the last door, the giving door, to be yours alone, because you are the one who will outlive me. And I want you to have something that is entirely your own, to do good with when I am gone." I argued. He won. He was right. I did not know, when I signed those founding papers, that I was signing the instrument of my own reckoning, the document that would one day let a dismissed old woman stand at a podium and hold a fortune in one hand and her daughter's whole future in the other. Cornelius died before we had given away even a third of it. He had not been sick long. That is its own mercy and its own cruelty. There was no long decline, no years of me feeding him by the spoon. But there was also almost no warning. Only a few months of a tiredness that was not like him, and a cough that the doctors took too lightly until they took it too seriously. And then a short, hard season, and then the spring. He died on an ordinary Wednesday in the spring, in our bed, with the window open the way we had married. And I held his hand, and I felt the man who had intended to build something that would outlast him let go of the building. And I have never in my life been more alone than I was in the hour after. I sat with him until the light came up, and I did not call anyone, because I was not ready to share him with the world's machinery of death just yet. And in that hour, in the gray light, with my husband's hand cooling in mine, I made him a promise. I promised him I would keep giving. I promised him I would not let the fund go quiet because he was gone. I did not promise to ever let anyone see. That part I had not yet learned I needed. The children came. They grieved in their ways. Marcus drove the 2 hours that same morning, the moment I called him, and he walked in the door and put his arms around me and held me for a long time without a word. And then he stayed 3 days and said almost nothing, and washed every dish in the house and fixed the back gate that had been hanging crooked for a year, his father's son, grieving with his hands. Vanessa flew in for the funeral, gave a beautiful eulogy about a father she had been too busy to call for the better part of a year. An eulogy that made 400 people cry because she was always good in front of a room, and there is no use pretending the love in it was not real, even though the attention had not been. She posted a photograph of his hands, the hands that had built a company and a marriage and a home, with a caption about legacy, and it received a great many comments. And she flew back out 40 hours later because, she said, the hospital could not run without her. And I stood in my driveway and watched her car go. And I went back inside the house her father built. And I was alone with a fortune and a promise and a silence so large, I did not know how I would live inside it. I did keep giving. In the first year after Cornelius died, in the worst of the grief, when some mornings the only reason I got out of the bed was that there was a gift to direct, I quietly moved money out of that fund and into the world the way he and I had planned. I want you to hear what that work actually was, because my daughter was about to tell me I had no way to contribute anything to anyone. And I want you to hold the truth of it against her words when they come. In those 2 years, I funded anonymously a free pediatric clinic that opened in a part of this city where the nearest doctor had been 40 minutes away by bus. And I sat in my car across the street the day it opened and watched the mothers carry their babies in out of the cold, and I wept alone where no one could see. I funded a scholarship that put 19 young people, most of them the first in their families to go, through nursing school. And every spring, an envelope of thank you cards comes to a post office box registered to the fund, addressed to a benefactor they will never meet. And I read every one. I funded the rebuilding of the very church my father had repaired for free 60 years ago. The small brick church with the windows that open, and I did it anonymously. And the congregation held a service of thanksgiving for the unknown giver. And I sat in the third pew, my father's pew, an old woman nobody recognized. And I bowed my head with the rest of them and thanked God for myself, which is a strange and lonely thing to do, and I did it anyway. And in the months after, as I sat alone in a paid-for house doing all of this, with a fund worth more than the hospital Vanessa worked at, my daughter began, gently and then less gently, to treat me as a problem to be managed. A widow with too much time. A mother who did not understand the demands of an important life. The calls grew shorter. The visits, never frequent, grew rarer. And when she did come, she came with a kind of bright impatience, looking at her phone, looking at her watch, treating the house her father built as a waiting room she was eager to leave. She began to talk to me the way you talk to someone whose decline you have already decided on. Slowly, a little loudly, explaining things to me I had understood before she was born. She decided, without asking me, that I should sell the house and move into a community by which she meant a place where old women are kept safe and out of the way. And she brought me glossy brochures for these places, with photographs of silver-haired people playing cards and being helped into vans. And she left them on my kitchen table, the same table where I had read the tax code by lamplight and struck the ruinous clauses out of contracts that built the hospital she worked in. And she said it was time to think about the future. When I told her I intended to stay in the home her father built me, she sighed the particular sigh of a busy person being burdened by a slow one. The sigh that says, "You are a task on my list that will not complete itself." And she said a thing I have carried ever since. She said, "Mom, I just worry about you out here, all alone, with no real way to contribute anything to anyone anymore. No real way to contribute anything to anyone anymore." I was, at that moment, the anonymous benefactor of a free pediatric clinic in 3 counties, a scholarship fund that had put 19 first-generation students through nursing school, and the single largest private donor to the very hospital foundation my daughter was about to be celebrated by. And she told me I had no way to contribute anything to anyone. I did not correct her. I want you to understand that this was not weakness. It was the discipline of a lifetime, the lesson off the floor of my grandmother's house. And it was also, I will admit to you because we are being honest tonight, a kind of pride that had curdled into a wound I was nursing. I had spent 60 years being the signature nobody saw, and somewhere in there the not being seen had stopped being a virtue and started being a cage. I told myself I was being humble. I was, in truth, also waiting. Waiting for what? I could not have told you that day. But I think some part of me, the part that keeps the books, knew that a day was coming when all of it would have to be read aloud. That day arrived in the form of an engraved invitation, cream-colored, heavy as a small plate, that came in the mail in October, almost exactly 2 years after Cornelius died. The St. Augustine Memorial Hospital Foundation, it said, requests the honor of your presence at its annual benefit gala, at which Dr. Vanessa Maddox Grant will be recognized for her visionary leadership in the establishment of the new cardiac pavilion. The new cardiac pavilion. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table, and I read that line 4 times. Because I knew exactly how the new cardiac pavilion had been established. I knew the figure that had established it. Because I had moved that figure out of the Cornelius Fund 18 months earlier, a gift large enough to build an entire new wing, given on one condition that the foundation had been only too happy to accept, that the donor remain completely anonymous. I had given my daughter's hospital the wing, and now my daughter was being honored for her visionary leadership in establishing it. I laughed. I want you to know that I laughed, alone in my kitchen. And it was not entirely a bitter laugh. There was something almost holy in it. The sheer audacity of the arrangement, the way life sometimes folds a thing so perfectly in half that you have to believe a hand larger than yours did the folding. My daughter had built her career, in part, on a generosity she did not know was mine, and she was about to stand in a ballroom and accept the credit for it, and the only person on earth who knew the truth was the old woman she had told had nothing left to contribute. I called the Foundation's development office the next morning. I did not give my name as the donor. The woman who answered did not know me as anything but Dr. Maddox Grant's mother, which was, I am sure, how I appeared on the seating list. I asked, very politely, whether the program for the evening would include any acknowledgement of the donors who had made the cardiac pavilion possible. The young woman, eager and kind, told me that yes, of course, the centerpiece of the evening would be the unveiling of the new donor wall and the reading of the founding donors' names, and that it was going to be very moving and that Dr. Maddox Grant herself had insisted on personally reading the names aloud as a gesture of gratitude. Dr. Maddox Grant herself had insisted on personally reading the names aloud. I thanked her, and I hung up, and I sat very still for a long time. That night, I did not sleep. I sat up at the kitchen table, the same table, the way I had sat up over the contracts and the tax code and the red number, except that there was nothing to calculate this time, only something to decide. I took down the box where I keep the things that matter, and I took out my grandmother's little marbled ledger, the real one, the one she kept on the highest shelf, that came to me when she died. And I turned its soft pages by lamplight, and I read the kindnesses she had written down in her strong hand 60 and 70 years ago. Who brought soup, who sat up with whom, the whole quiet economy of a family that gave and asked for nothing. And I came to the last entry she ever made, in a shakier hand near the end. And it said only, "Taught Lorraine to keep the ledger." And I sat there in the lamplight, with my grandmother's handwriting in my lap, and the engraved invitation on the table. And I understood, finally, the thing it had taken me 64 years to understand. My grandmother had not raised me to be unseen. She had raised me to keep the ledger. And a ledger that is never read is not a ledger. It is just a box on a high shelf, gathering dust, while the people you love grow up believing the account is empty. And then I did the thing that I had been raised never to do. I made a decision to be seen, not for pride, not for revenge. I made a decision to read the ledger out loud, the way my grandmother always said the Lord would, because my daughter had grown up next to a full account and been allowed to believe it was empty. And a mother who lets that stand is not being humble. She is being a coward. And I have been many things in my 64 years. The signature nobody saw, the hidden hand, the woman by the kitchen doors. I decided, that night, with my grandmother's ledger in my lap, that I would not be a coward. I am going to tell you exactly how I prepared, because I think the preparation is the part of these stories that people rush past, and it is the part that I am proudest of, because there was no rage in it. There was only the careful, patient work of a woman who had kept the books for 40 years, finally deciding to balance one particular account. First, I called my lawyer, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Adiz, who had taken over the fund's affairs after Cornelius died, and who knew the whole truth. The only living soul besides me who did. She was younger than my daughter. Brilliant, the kind of woman who reads a 40-page document once and can tell you what is missing from page 31. And she had earned my trust slowly over 2 years, by never once treating me as anything other than the formidable client I was. She did not know my family. She knew only the fund, and the trustee, and the work. I called her, and I told her what I had learned, that the wing I had built was being credited to my own daughter, that my daughter had announced a second gift she did not have, that the donor list was to be read aloud at a gala by the very child who had told her mother she had nothing left to give. She was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of a good lawyer deciding how blunt to be. And then she said, in her measured way, "Lorraine, do you understand the position you are in? Let me say it plainly, because I do not think you are letting yourself feel it. You are not a guest at this gala. You are its foundation. Without the gift you made, there is no cardiac pavilion. There is no donor wall. There is no honor to bestow on Dr. Maddox Grant, because there is nothing for her to have led the building of. And the second gift, the children's surgery unit she has promised in public on the strength of a relationship with a benefactor she has never identified, exists only if you say it exists, Because you are the benefactor and you have committed nothing. She has built her year, possibly her career, on a foundation that is, in the most literal sense, your signature. Without you, none of it stands. And I said quietly, I understand. And she said, then the only question, Lorraine, is what you want to do with that. You can do nothing and sit at your table and let it pass, and no one will ever know. You can withdraw quietly and let her promise to the city collapse on its own, and that would be a kind of justice too, and a colder one. Or you can decide to be known. But you should choose it on purpose, because once a thing like this is said out loud in a room like that, it cannot be unsaid. And that, friends, is the truest question anyone had asked me in 2 years. Not what is fair, not what is owed. What do you want to do with the power you have spent your whole life pretending not to have? I did not want to humiliate my daughter. I need you to believe that. Because what happened later might make you doubt it, and I would not blame you. I did not lie awake plotting her destruction. I am not built that way, and Cornelius would have hated it. And more than that, I did not want to win the kind of victory that leaves you uglier than the person you defeated. But I had spent 2 years being told I was nothing by the one person I had nearly bankrupted myself to make into something. And I had reached the end of a road I did not even know I had been walking. I was not going to sit at table 19 and clap. I was done being the signature nobody saw. There was a second thing I learned in that phone call with Adeze, and it is the thing that turned a quiet evening of being recognized into something with real weight. Vanessa, it turned out, had done more than accept credit for a gift she did not know was her mother's. In the lead-up to the gala, in the speeches and the interviews and the glossy brochure, she had publicly committed the foundation to a second, even larger project, a children's cardiac surgery unit. And she had told the board and the press that she was confident the lead funding was, in her words, already as good as secured. She had pledged it, in public, on the strength of a relationship with an anonymous benefactor she believed her own connections had cultivated. I had read it in the paper, in her own words. There was a profile of her in the city magazine, with a glossy photograph of her in her white coat. And in it, she spoke about the children's surgery unit as though it were already real, already funded. And she said, and I am quoting her exactly, because I read it more than once, our partnership with our anonymous lead donor has been transformative, and I am confident the support for this next phase is already in place. I am confident the support is already in place. She had told a magazine, told the board, told the whole city that the money was secured. On the strength of a relationship she believed her own brilliance had built with a faceless benefactor she had never once tried to find. The anonymous benefactor was me, and I had committed nothing. Not $1 of that second gift had left the fund, because not $1 of it had been requested of me by anyone, because no one knew there was a me to request it from. My daughter had stood in front of the most important people in the city and promised them a children's surgery unit on the assumption that the money would simply appear, the way money had always simply appeared in her life, from a source she had never bothered to find because she had never imagined it might be sitting at table 19 with an untouched glass of water. I asked Adeze to prepare 2 documents. The first was a single sheet of paper, a formal letter on the fund's letterhead, signed by me as sole trustee, confirming the gift that had built the cardiac pavilion and, for the first time in the fund's history, waiving the donor's anonymity. The second was a pledge letter for the children's surgery unit. Fully funded, the entire amount, more money than my daughter had dared to promise, made out and signed and ready, with one line at the bottom that I dictated to a daze myself, and that I will tell you about when we get there. I put both letters into the oxblood leather portfolio with the little gold compass rose pressed into its corner. The portfolio that had been Cornelius's, that he had carried to every important meeting of his life, that still smelled faintly of him if I held it close. And I closed the brass clasp, and I went to find a dress. I had not bought myself a fine thing in years. I want you to understand that this was not because I could not afford it. I could have bought the shop. It was because I had spent 60 years in the uniform of the unseen. And somewhere along the way, I had come to believe that to be plain was to be good. That a fine thing on my own body would be a kind of announcement. And you do not announce your worth. I had a closet full of the careful, modest clothes of a woman who let her worth be discovered. Sensible navy and respectable gray. Blouses bought on sale and worn for 15 years, the wardrobe of a woman quietly hiding a fortune inside a life that looked like it had none. And I stood in front of that closet the week before the gala, and I looked at all that careful gray. And I understood that I could not walk into that ballroom as the woman in this closet. The woman in this closet would sit at table 19 and clap. To do what I had decided to do, I would have to dress as the woman I actually was, the woman who had built things, and I did not own her clothes. So I went into a shop I had never let myself enter, a hushed and expensive place where a young woman approached me with the polite uncertainty people show an old black woman in sensible shoes in a store like that. And I told her, in the voice that carries, the telephone voice, that I was attending a gala, and I wished to be the best-dressed woman in the room. And I watched her recalibrate, and I let her. And then she helped me, beautifully, for 2 hours. And I bought a gown of charcoal silk shot through with threads of real gold, gold that caught the light when I moved so that I seemed to be lit from within, with a high collar that rose to just beneath my chin, severe and beautiful. The dress of a woman who has finally decided to be looked at. The dress of a queen who has spent her whole reign disguised as a servant, and has chosen, on one particular night, to put the crown on. I bought jet black bead earrings that fell almost to my shoulders and caught the light when I turned my head, and a single heavy gold cuff for my wrist. And I wore my hair the way I had worn it since I cut it short the year after Cornelius died, close to my head and silver as a coin, because I was done hiding the years. I looked at myself in the mirror in that shop, a tall, lean woman of 64, with high cheekbones and a small gap in her front teeth and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain against the gold of the dress. And for the first time in 2 years, I did not see a problem to be managed. I saw a woman who had built things. I saw Lorraine. On the night of the gala, I dressed alone in the house Cornelius built. I stood in front of the long mirror in the room we had shared, in the charcoal and the gold, with the jet at my ears and the gold cuff on my wrist and my silver hair close to my head. And I put on the reading glasses on their beaded chain and then took them off again and let them hang against the gold. And I looked at the woman in the glass for a long time, and I said to her out loud in the empty house, "You built things. Say it." And I said it. I built things. And then I picked up Cornelius's oxblood portfolio with the 2 letters inside it and the little gold compass rose worn nearly smooth. And I drove myself, because I had no intention of arriving on anyone's arm or leaving when anyone else was ready. In the car, alone, at a red light halfway downtown, the old fear came up one last time, the lesson off the floor of my grandmother's house. You do not announce your worth. Sit down, smile, let it pass. And I felt my courage waver, the way it always wavers at the last light before a hard thing. and I put my hand on the portfolio on the seat beside me, the leather worn soft by my husband's hands and then by mine. And I said, into the empty car, "Cornelius, I am going to read the ledger out loud tonight. I hope I am doing it for the right reasons. I hope you would be proud." And the light turned green, and I do not believe in signs, not the cheap kind. But I will tell you that in 40 years that man never once told me I was wrong to be more than I let on. And in the green of that light I felt him, plain as the wheel under my hands, telling me to go. The hospital had rented the grand ballroom of the old downtown hotel, the one with the gold leaf ceiling and the staircase that pours down into the room like water. And the valets in their red coats did not quite know what to make of me when I handed them the keys to an 11-year-old car wearing a gown that cost more than the car. One of them, a young man, looked from the car to the gown and back, confused. And I gave him a smile, because it was not his fault that the world teaches you to read a person by the wrong things, and I took my little numbered card. Table 19. Near the kitchen doors. Of course, where they seat the relatives, nobody is supposed to photograph. I looked at that little card with its number, and I thought, you have seated me by the kitchen doors for the last time. And I walked in. I want to describe that room to you the way I saw it, because you cannot understand what the reading of a name can do unless you understand the room it falls into. 400 people, and I knew the type of every one of them. The donors and the doctors and the board members and the wives and the husbands. The people who run a city quietly the way I had run a company quietly, except that they wore their power on the outside, on their wrists and at their throats, and in the easy way they touched each other's elbows. There were 3 chandeliers the size of small cars. There was an orchestra. There was, on a great easel near the staircase, a tall object draped in white cloth, which I knew to be the new donor wall, waiting to be unveiled. And there was, at the head of the room, raised on a low platform, a podium with the foundation seal on the front of it, and beside the podium, greeting the important people as they arrived, glowing, magnificent, my daughter. Vanessa was 41 years old that night, and she had never looked more like the small fire I had raised. She wore a gown of deep emerald that I am certain cost more than the wing she did not know she was being honored for. And her hair was swept up, and diamonds I did not recognize moved at her ears. And she moved through that room the way water moves downhill, certain, gathering, pulled toward the lowest and most important point, which was always wherever the most powerful person was standing. I watched her from across the room for a long time before she saw me, and I felt the old love and the old ache braided together so tightly I could not have pulled them apart with my hands. When she finally saw me, something passed across her face that I will remember until I die. It was not joy. For just a half-second before she arranged it, it was alarm. The alarm of a woman whose 2 worlds, the important one and the embarrassing one, were never supposed to be in the same room. And then she smiled, the rehearsed smile, and she came toward me, cutting through the crowd, and she took both my hands, and she said, loudly enough for the people nearby to hear, "Mama, you came." And then, more quietly, leaning in so that only I could hear, with that same smile fixed on her face for the benefit of the room, she said, "You didn't have to do this. I had a car ready to take you. You look." She paused and looked at the gown, the real gold in it, the jet at my ears, and I watched her try to understand it and fail. "You look very dressed up," I said. "It's a special night. I'm proud of you." And she said, the smile never moving, "Sit at your table, all right? It's going to be a long evening, and I don't want you getting tired. I'll come find you." She did not come find me. I sat at table 19, between a retired anesthesiologist who was kind to me and a development officer's husband, who spent the entire dinner on his phone. And I watched my daughter work the room. And I held Cornelius's portfolio on my lap under the white tablecloth. And I waited. The anesthesiologist, an older gentleman with kind eyes and a slight tremor in his hands, made conversation with me the way decent people do with a relative they assume has been seated out of the way. And at one point he asked me, gently, "And how are you connected to our wonderful Dr. Maddox Grant?" And I looked at the easel with its white-draped wall, and I looked at my daughter glowing across the room, and I felt the whole strange weight of the evening press down on me. And I said simply, "I'm her mother." And he smiled and said, "You must be very proud." And I said, "I am." And I was. That is the thing people do not understand about a night like this. The pride and the wound do not cancel each other out. They sit side by side in your chest, both true, both heavy, and you carry them both up the length of the room when the time comes. I watched Vanessa move from cluster to cluster of important people. And I watched the way she touched their arms and laughed at the right moments and leaned in to hear over the orchestra. And I saw, with a mother's eye, how hard she was working, how much of her was performance, how tired she would be underneath it all when the night was over. And I felt a grief for her that was older than the grief for her father. Because I understood, watching her, that my daughter had spent her whole life believing that this, the glittering room, the important faces, the name on the wall, was what would finally fill the place in her that had always been hungry. And I knew, because I had lived twice as long as she had, that it would not. That it never does. That the hunger she was feeding with rooms like this one was a hunger that only the truth can fill, and that she had been starving for the truth for 41 years. And that I, God forgive me, had been one of the people starving her, by hiding my whole self from her in the name of humility. I held the portfolio a little tighter, and I waited. The dinner was the dinner those evenings always are. The chicken and the speeches, the board chairman thanking the board, the foundation director thanking the board chairman, the slow accumulation of self-congratulation that wealthy people perform for one another to convince themselves that comfort and goodness are the same thing. I ate very little. And then, after the plates were cleared, the lights dimmed, and a single warm spotlight found the podium. And Vanessa rose to a long, swelling wave of applause, and she stepped up to the foundation seal. And she began to speak. She was good. I will give her that. And I give it to you, because I want you to see her clearly and not as a cartoon. She spoke about medicine as a calling. She spoke about the children whose hearts would now be mended in a place that had not existed 3 years ago. She spoke, with real feeling, about her father, my Cornelius. And she said that everything she did to honor a man who taught her that you build things that outlast you. And I sat at table 19 and felt the tears come, because that part was true, even from her, even there. And then she pivoted, the way she always could, from the true thing to the thing that served her. And she began to talk about the work of building the cardiac pavilion. And she used the word vision, and she used the word leadership. And she said, with a small, modest laugh that the room loved, that of course she could not have done it alone, that it had taken a great many generous friends, and that she wanted to take a moment to recognize the most generous of them all. And here, friends, is the part I came to tell you. She gestured to the easel, and two young people in foundation polo shirts drew the white cloth away from the donor wall. And it was beautiful, I will say that. A tall panel of bronze and glass with the names of the foundation's great supporters etched into it in order of the size of their gift. The lesser gifts at the bottom and the greater ones rising toward the top, the way names always rise toward the top in rooms like that. And at the very top, alone, in letters larger than all the others, set apart in a place of obvious honor, was a single line that read, in elegant etched capitals, the words that I had insisted on 18 months before when I made the gift. The words I had chosen precisely because they would tell no one anything. The Cornelius Fund. And my daughter turned to that name, the name of her own dead father, the name of the fund her mother had built and ran and signed for. And she lifted her glass of champagne toward it. And she said to 400 of the most important people in the city, I want to thank, more than anyone, our anonymous lead benefactor, the Cornelius Fund, whoever you are, wherever you are tonight. You changed this city, and I only wish you could be here in this room to see what your generosity built. I only wish you could be here in this room. I was in the room. I was at table 19 with an untouched glass of water and her father's portfolio on my lap. And then, because the Lord has a sense of timing that I have stopped trying to understand, my daughter set down her glass and she looked out over that sea of glittering people. And her eyes, sweeping the room for the warm, easy applause she was owed, snagged for just a moment on table 19, on her mother in the gold-shot gown. And something in her face flickered, some old irritation, the irritation of the busy being slowed by the slow. And she made a choice. She made the choice that ended one chapter of our lives and began another. She smiled her rehearsed smile, and she said, into the microphone, warmly, as though it were a charming aside, You know, my mother is here tonight. And the spotlight, on a cue from somebody, swung and found me, and 400 faces turned, and I sat very still in the white light. And Vanessa said, she raised me on almost nothing, God bless her. And she's the reason I understand what it means to give back, even when you don't have much to give. And then she laughed, lightly, and she added the line. She said, she's our reminder tonight that you don't need a fortune to have a heart. Some of us give millions, and some of us, like my sweet mama, just give what little we can. And the room laughed, the soft, well-dressed laugh. And someone began to applaud the charming old woman in the gold dress, and Vanessa beamed. And I understood that my own daughter had just stood in front of the most important people in the city and used me, used my supposed poverty, used the modest life I had hidden a fortune inside of for 30 years, as the warm-up joke before the real giving was discussed. She had called me, in front of 400 people, in not so many words, a charity case. A nice old reminder that even the poor have hearts. While standing beneath a wall that bore my husband's name on a gift I had signed, I felt the room's eyes on me, the kind, pitying, amused eyes, and I felt the old lesson rise up. The lesson off the floor of my grandmother's house. You do not announce your worth. You let it be discovered. Sit down, smile, let it pass. And I felt, underneath that, something older and quieter and stronger than the lesson. Something that I think had been waiting in me since the day Cornelius let go of the building. Something that finally, at 64 years old, in a borrowed ballroom under a gold leaf ceiling, stood up. So I stood up. I want to slow down here, because the next few minutes are the ones I have lived 1,000 times in the 2 years since, and I want to give them to you exactly as they were, without dressing them up, because the truth of them is better than anything I could add. I stood up at table 19, and the applause faltered, the way a sound does when the thing it is about does something unexpected. People do not stand up when they are being gently mocked. They shrink. I did not shrink. I stood to my full height, which is considerable, and I picked up Cornelius's oxblood portfolio from my lap, and I held it against the gold of my dress, and the spotlight, which had been on me as a kindness, a way of letting the room coo at the poor old mother, stayed on me now as something else, because the operator could see what the room could not yet feel, that something was happening. Vanessa's smile flickered. From the podium she said lightly, covering, "Mama, is everything all right? Do you need to step out?" And I said, in a voice that I had not used in 2 years, the voice I used to use on the telephone with the bankers who did not know what color my hand was, a clear, level, unhurried voice that carried in that suddenly quiet room without my having to raise it at all. I said, "No, Vanessa, I don't need to step out. I came a long way to be in this room, and I think I'll stay in it." I began to walk toward the front. It is not a short walk, from table 19 by the kitchen doors to a platform at the head of a grand ballroom, and I made it slowly, in no hurry the way Cornelius taught me. A tall, silver-haired woman in charcoal and gold walking up the center of that room with a leather portfolio held to her chest, and you could have heard a pin drop on that gold-leaf floor. 400 of the most important people in the city watched an old woman they had just been invited to pity walk toward the podium where her daughter stood. And not one of them breathed, because some animal part of every person in that room knew that they were about to watch something they would tell their grandchildren about. Vanessa met me at the foot of the platform. She came down the 2 steps quickly, and she put her hand on my arm, and the microphone caught the edge of her voice as she hissed, low and urgent and no longer smiling at all, "Mama, what are you doing? Sit down. You're embarrassing yourself. Sit down right now. You're embarrassing yourself." I looked at my daughter, my bright, loud, beautiful daughter, the small fire I had spent my life and very nearly my fortune keeping fed. And I felt no anger. That is the strangest part, and the part I most want you to understand. In that moment, I felt no anger at all. I felt the enormous, aching tenderness you feel for someone who is about to learn something that is going to hurt them, and that they have earned, and that you cannot save them from, and would not if you could. I put my hand over her hand, the one gripping my arm, gently, the way you gentle a frightened animal, and I leaned in, close to her, close enough to smell the diamonds and the fear, and I said quietly, just for her. Before any of it became public, I said, "Vanessa, I love you, and I am about to do something, and I need you to know that I am not doing it to hurt you. I am doing it because you said I had nothing to give, and a mother cannot let that stand." Then I stepped past her, and I climbed the 2 steps to the platform, and I stood beside the podium with the foundation seal on it, and I turned to face 400 people, and I set Cornelius's portfolio down on the podium, and I opened the brass clasp. The foundation director, a careful man named Walter, who I would later learn had been told nothing, hurried toward the platform with the panicked half-smile of a man whose carefully run evening is going somewhere he did not plan. And he reached for the microphone, and he said smoothly, "Thank you so much, ma'am. Perhaps we could." And I turned to him, and I said, 4 words only, in that clear, unhurried voice. "Read the first letter." And I took the first sheet of paper out of the portfolio, the single sheet on the fund's letterhead, and I held it out to him, and I said it again, gently. "Read it. Out loud. You'll want to." Walter took the paper because he did not know what else to do, and he looked at it. and I watched his face change. I watched a man read a sentence and feel the floor of his evening tilt under him. He looked up at me, and then at Vanessa, and then back at the paper, and his mouth opened and nothing came out. And so I said, "To the room now," in the voice that carries, "Then I'll read it." I took the paper back from his nerveless hand. I put on the reading glasses that hung from the beaded chain against the gold of my dress. And into the silence of that enormous room, beneath the gold leaf ceiling, beneath the bronze wall that bore my husband's name, I read aloud, slowly, so that every word would land, the following. To the St. Augustine Memorial Hospital Foundation. This letter confirms that the gift of the Cornelius Fund, in the amount that established the cardiac pavilion in its entirety, was made by the fund's sole trustee, and that the trustee hereby waives, for the first and only time, the anonymity that has governed every gift this fund has ever made. The trustee wishes the foundation and its honored guests to know the name behind the gift. Signed this day by the sole trustee of the Cornelius Fund, Lorraine Cornelius Maddox. I lowered the paper. I have told you that you cannot understand the reading of a name without understanding the room it falls into, and I am going to ask you to imagine it now, because no description I give will be enough. 400 people who run a city. A bronze wall with the words, "The Cornelius Fund," etched in capitals taller than all the others. A daughter at the foot of a platform with her hand still half raised toward a mother she had introduced 90 seconds before, as a sweet old reminder that even the poor have hearts. And the name on the gift, the name that built the wing, the name that this entire glittering evening had been constructed to honor, was the name of the woman in the gold-shot gown standing at the podium. The charity case. The reminder? Me. The silence held for one full second, and then it broke. Not into applause, but into a sound I have never heard before or since. A single enormous intake of breath, 400 people gasping at once, and then a rising murmur that became a roar. And somewhere in the back, a woman began to cry, and the orchestra members were turning to one another, and the board members were on their feet. And through all of it, I stood very still at the podium, and I looked down, off the edge of the platform, at my daughter. Vanessa had not moved. Her hand was still half raised. Her beautiful rehearsed face had come completely apart, the way a face does when the story it has been telling itself for a lifetime is corrected in a single sentence in front of everyone whose opinion it has ever cared about. Her mouth was open. Her eyes had gone wide and wet and lost, and she was looking up at me. And I watched her try to assemble the words "anonymous benefactor" and "Cornelius Fund," and "my mama gives what little she can" into a shape that made sense. And I watched her fail. And I watched the failure turn into understanding, and the understanding turn into a horror so total that for a moment I nearly went to her. A mother's body does not unlearn the impulse to catch a falling child. But I did not go to her. There was one more thing to do, and it was the most important thing. And it was the thing that turned this from a humiliation into a reckoning, which are not the same, and I needed you to be here for the difference. I reached into the portfolio and I took out the second letter. I want to tell you about the second letter because the first letter was justice, and the second letter was the thing my grandmother actually raised me for, off the floor of that warm, stubborn house. And if you remember nothing else from this story, I would like you to remember this. I held up the second letter, and the room, which had been roaring, went quiet again, hungry now, because they could all feel that the first letter had only been the beginning. And I said, "Into that hunger, I have one more thing to read." And then I looked down at my daughter one more time, and I said, just to her. But the microphone carried it. Gently, Vanessa. You stood up here tonight, and you promised these good people a children's surgery unit. You told them the lead funding was as good as secured. I have read about it in the paper. You pledged something, in public, that you did not have. And I watched her face, and she knew that I had her. That I could end her career and her marriage, and her standing in that city with the next 2 sentences. That I could turn her public promise into a public lie in front of every person who had ever made her feel important. And that I had every right to. And then I did not. I said into the microphone, to the room, in the level, unhurried voice, this is a pledge letter from the Cornelius Fund. It commits the full funding of the Children's Cardiac Surgery Unit that Dr. Maddox Grant announced this evening. The entire amount. It is signed, and it is binding, and it is effective tonight. I held it up so they could see it was real. And then I said the line I had dictated to Adaze, the line at the bottom of the letter, the line that was the whole reason I had come. And I read it aloud, slowly, looking not at the room, but down at my daughter's wrecked and lifted face. I read, this gift is made in honor of Dr. Vanessa Maddox Grant, who learned how to give from a mother who taught her by doing it quietly. May she carry it forward. And I lowered the letter, and I took off my reading glasses. And into the silence I said the only thing left to say, the thing I had walked the length of that ballroom to say, the thing I am, in truth, still saying, to her and to you, and to anyone who has ever been made small by someone they made large. I said, Vanessa, I did not need you to know who I was. I have given away more than this city will ever count, and I have done it gladly. And I would have gone to my grave, letting your father's name take the credit, because that is how I was raised, and it is how I am made. But you told me I had nothing to give. You told me I could not contribute anything to anyone anymore. And a mother can carry a great deal of being overlooked, but she cannot carry being told that her whole life amounted to nothing by the child she spent it on. So I came here tonight, not to take anything from you, but to give you the one thing you would not let me give you any other way. The truth. I am not a reminder that the poor have hearts. I am the reason this room exists, and I am still your mother, and I love you, and I always did. Then I closed Cornelius's portfolio, and I fastened the brass clasp, and I walked down the 2 steps off the platform, and I did not look back. And 400 of the most important people in the city rose to their feet in a wave that started near the front and rolled to the back of that enormous room. And they did not applaud my fortune. I want you to understand that. They had been applauding fortunes all night. They rose and they put their hands together for a long time, for something else, something they did not have a clean word for, something about a woman who had been handed an opportunity to destroy her child and had used it to bless her instead. I walked the length of the ballroom for the 2nd time that night. And this time, it was not a long, lonely walk past the kitchen doors. This time, the most powerful people in the city reached out to touch my arm as I passed. And I let them. And I nodded. And I kept walking. And at the great doors, I handed the valet my ticket for the 11-year-old car. And I drove myself home, alone, the way I had come. To the house that Cornelius built. That is the reckoning. But it is not the end of the story. And I have learned that the part that comes after the reckoning is the part that tells you what the reckoning was actually for. I am going to tell you what happened to Vanessa, because I know you want to know, and because the answer is the whole point. She did not call me that night. I did not expect her to. A wound like the one I had opened does not close in an evening. And the truth I had given her was not a gift she could unwrap quickly. For 3 days there was nothing, and I let there be nothing. Because I have learned that you cannot rush another person toward the door of their own understanding. You can only leave it unlocked. On the 4th day, she came to the house. She came in the morning, without calling, which she had never once done in 20 years. And she stood on the porch of the house her father built, in ordinary clothes, with no diamonds and no rehearsed face. And when I opened the door, she did not speak. She looked at me, and her face crumpled the way it had crumpled in the ballroom. Except that there was no audience now, only her mother and the open door. And she said, in a voice I had not heard from her since she was a little girl, "Mama." And I opened the door wider. And she came in, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table. And for a long time, neither of us said anything at all. And then my daughter, 41 years old, a doctor whose name goes on things, put her head down on my kitchen table, and she wept the way you weep when something you built your whole self on has been corrected. And I put my hand on the back of her neck, the way I used to when she was small, and the fire in her had burned her, and I let her cry. And I did not say I told you so, because I had not told her so. I had shown her, and there is all the difference in the world. When she could speak, she said the things that people say. She said she was sorry. She said it over and over, the word coming out broken, "Sorry, Mama, I'm so sorry." And I let her say it as many times as she needed to, because an apology that has been dammed up for years does not come out in one clean sentence. It comes out in pieces, and you have to let all the pieces come. She said she had not known. She said she had spent the 4 days since the gala unable to eat or sleep, going back over 100 small moments, the restaurant dinner I had paid for, the brochures for the community she had left on my table, the wallpaper, the word charity case, replaying them now against the truth. And she said that each one was a knife. And I did not tell her it should be, though it should have been. And she said, and this is the one that mattered, the one I had been waiting 2 years and perhaps 41 years to hear. She lifted her wrecked face off my kitchen table, and she looked at me and she said, "Mama, why didn't you ever tell me? All these years. Why did you let me think you had nothing? Why did you let me become the kind of person who could say what I said?" And I told her the truth, which is the same truth I am telling you, and I did not soften it, because I have learned that softening the truth is how you starve the people you love. I said, "Because I was raised to let my worth be discovered, baby, by your great-grandmother, off the floor of a house with a wood stove. And she was right, mostly. And the world she raised me in needed me to know it. But I carried that lesson too far and too long. And somewhere in there, my pride and my humility got so tangled up, I could not tell them apart anymore. And I started calling it humility when it had become pride. The pride of the person who is too good to be thanked. I let you not see me. That is a thing I did, Vanessa. Not only a thing you did, and I will not let you take all of this onto yourself, because some of it is mine. I hid from my own daughter for 30 years, and then I was wounded that she could not see me in the dark I had made. And I am not sorry I gave the money quietly. I would do that again, every dollar of it, the same way. But I am sorry I gave you so little of the truth of who your mother was, that you grew up thinking quietness and nothing were the same thing. They are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. I was never nothing. And neither, when you are quiet, when the world looks through you, when they seat you by the kitchen doors, are you. That is what I came to that ballroom to teach you. I just did not know. Until I was standing at that podium with your whole life in my hand, that I had as much to learn from the night as you did. We talked until the light moved across the kitchen and went gold and then went gray. She asked me about her father, the real things, the things she had been too busy to ask while he was alive. And I told her, and some of them made her laugh and some of them made her cry again. And it was the first real conversation my daughter and I had had in 15 years, and it cost a public reckoning under a gold leaf ceiling to buy it, and I would pay that price again tomorrow. Here is what I want you to understand about what happened to Vanessa, because I think you came to this story expecting her to be ruined, and I understand why. Because that is the shape these stories usually take. And I will not pretend a part of me did not want it, in the ballroom, in the white light, with her hand still half raised. I could have ruined her. I held the letter that would have done it. I have thought a great deal, in the 2 years since, about why I did not. And the answer is the thing my grandmother actually raised me for. The thing underneath the lesson about letting your worth be discovered. The deeper thing the lesson was only ever a clumsy translation of. She did not raise me to be unseen. She raised me to be a person whose giving was so large that it did not depend on being thanked. And the largest gift I have ever given in my life, larger than the wing, larger than the surgery unit, larger than any number I have ever moved out of that fund, was the gift of not destroying my daughter on the night I finally could have. That was the reckoning, not the humiliation, the mercy. The reckoning was that I proved, in front of 400 people and in front of God and in front of myself, that the woman my daughter had called a charity case was so far above her in the only accounting that matters that she could hold her child's entire life in her hand and choose freely to set it down gently. Vanessa is a different woman now. I will not tell you she is perfect, because she is not, and neither am I. And a person does not undo 40 years of measuring rooms in 2. There are still days the old Vanessa surfaces, the one who checks her phone, the one who needs the room to be looking at her. And I see it, and I let it go, because I am not raising her anymore. I am loving her. And there is a difference, and the difference is patience. But she is the head of that children's cardiac surgery unit now, the one the Cornelius Fund built, the one I funded in her name with a letter she did not know I was carrying. And she runs it well, better than well. And the strangest and most beautiful thing has happened, which is that the work has begun to change her in the way I always prayed it would. She comes home from that unit, where she holds the hands of frightened parents whose children's hearts are being mended, and she is quieter than she used to be, and softer around the eyes. Because you cannot do that work, real work, the kind that does not care whether anyone is watching, and stay the woman who needs the room. The children are teaching her what I could not. And she does a thing she never did before, which is that twice a month she drives out to the house her father built, and she sits at the kitchen table, the same table, and she asks her mother what she thinks. And then, and this is the miracle, she is quiet and she listens to the answer, all the way to the end of it, the way her father used to listen to me by the water with the gulls going over. She has learned slowly the patience her father said life would teach her, and that he hoped he would be there to see soften her. And I like to think that he is, somehow, that some part of him is in the room when she laughs at my kitchen table. Finally unhurried, that finally still. She asked me a few months ago, sitting at that table, whether I was angry that I had to do it that way, in front of everyone. Whether I wished I had been able to just tell her quietly across this same table years ago and spare us both the ballroom. And I thought about it, honestly, the way she has learned to wait for me to do. And I told her the truth. I said, "No, baby. I do not think you could have heard it quietly. I do not think I could have said it quietly. We had both spent too long in our roles, you in the bright room and me by the kitchen doors. And a thing like that, once it has set as hard as ours had set, does not break with a quiet word at a kitchen table. It breaks with a hammer in the light in front of witnesses. Or it does not break at all. The ballroom was the hammer. I am sorry it had to hurt. I am not sorry it broke. I called Marcus the morning after the gala, before the story had reached him, because I did not want my son to hear it from anyone but me. I told him everything, the whole of it, the wing and the fund and the wall and his sister's words and what I had done. He was quiet on the line for a long moment, my steady son. And then he said, in his low voice, his father's voice, "Mama, I always knew you and Daddy were something more than you let on. I didn't know the size of it. But I knew." And then he was quiet again. And then he said, "Are you all right?" Not is Vanessa all right? Though he asked that too and meant it. But first, are you all right? And I realized that in all the years of being the signature nobody saw, my older child had been seeing me the whole time. Quietly, the way his father did, asking for nothing. And I put my hand over my mouth and I cried into the phone. And 3 days later, there was a card in the mail in his careful hardware store hand. And inside it, he had written only one line. It said, "You were never the smallest one in any room, Mama. We just let you sit there. I have that card on the shelf next to the portfolio." Grant, her husband, the man with the firm handshake who had filed us under modest people not worth cultivating, has been a great deal more attentive since the night of the gala. And I find this funny in a way I try not to be unkind about. Because of course he has. That is exactly the kind of man he is. The kind who recalibrates the moment the numbers change, and the numbers changed. But Vanessa has changed how she lets him treat me, and that matters more than his sudden attention. And I take it as a sign that the right thing got planted in her that night, and is growing. She corrected him once, in front of me, gently but in a way that left no room, when he spoke to me the old way, the slightly too loud, slightly too slow way. And I saw his surprise, and I saw her not back down. And I knew then that whatever else the ballroom had cost, it had bought my daughter a spine where I was concerned. And a spine is worth more than a wing. The wall is still there, in the lobby of the cardiac pavilion. The bronze and glass wall with the names rising toward the top. But there is a new line at the very top now, above the Cornelius Fund, that the foundation added after that night, with my permission. The only public acknowledgement of my name I have ever allowed. And it does not list a number, because the number was never the point. It says simply, "In honor of Lorraine Cornelius Maddox, who built quietly and gave greatly, and asked for nothing but to be seen at last." And sometimes I drive down there, to the hospital, and I sit in the lobby in my ordinary clothes, my sensible navy, my respectable gray, an old woman nobody recognizes. And I watch the families come and go, the frightened parents and the small children with mended hearts. And I look up at that wall. And here is the strange thing, the thing I did not expect. I am not sitting there to be recognized. Nobody knows me in that lobby, and I like it that way. I have gone back, you see, to being the unseen woman in the plain coat, and it does not feel like a cage anymore. Because the difference is that now the account has been read. Once a ledger has been read out loud, even once, in the light, you can carry it quietly again, for the rest of your life. And it is not a burden. It is a peace. I think about my grandmother's wood stove and her little marbled ledger now in my granddaughter's serious hands, and the bank that would not lend to a hand it could not see, and the second mortgage I signed without my hand shaking, and the peeling wallpaper, and the restaurant dinner I paid for with money I did not have, and the 2 letters in the oxblood portfolio, and the long walk up the center of that room, and my daughter's face coming apart and then, slowly, coming back together into something truer than it had ever been. And I am, after 64 years, content. There is one more thing, and then I will let you go. A few weeks ago, Vanessa's oldest, my granddaughter, a serious girl at 12 who reminds me, in the quietest way, of Marcus, was sitting at my kitchen table while her mother and I talked, and she was watching me the way that child watches everything, taking it in, saying nothing. And when it was time to go, she hung back, and she said, "Grandma, can I ask you something?" And I said, "Always." And she said, "Were you really the one who built the hospital the way Mom says now?" And I said, "Your grandfather and I built it, baby, the 2 of us together." And she was quiet. And then she said, "But you let everybody think it was somebody else for a really long time. Why?" And I looked at that serious girl, and I went to the high shelf, and I took down my grandmother's little marbled ledger, and I put it in her hands, and I told her what her great-great-grandmother told me, about the soup and the sitting up and the Lord's bigger book, and about being unseen as a kind of power that must not be allowed to become a cage. And then I told her the thing I had learned that her great-great-grandmother never got to learn, the thing the ballroom taught me. I said, "Keep the ledger, baby. Give quietly all your life, and ask for nothing. But do not let the people you love grow up believing the account is empty. A ledger is meant to be read. One day when the time is right, in the light, you read it out loud." And I gave her the ledger to keep, and she holds it now, and I think the account is in good hands. I still have the portfolio. It sits on the shelf in the room that was Cornelius's study. The oxblood leather worn soft at the corners, the little gold compass rose nearly rubbed away by his hands, and then by mine. I take it down sometimes, and I hold it, and it still smells faintly of him. And I think about the 2 of us in that parking garage, young in our 50s, terrified of what the money would do to the people we loved, making each other a promise. We were right to be afraid. The money did damage. But the promise held in the end, in a way we could not have foreseen, because the very rule we made to protect our children, the rule that we would give quietly and ask for nothing, was the rule that gave me, at the lowest moment of my life, the power to walk into that ballroom holding the whole truth and choose, in front of everyone, to be merciful instead of right. I would not trade that for all the recognition in the world. But I will tell you, and I am not ashamed to say it, that it was a fine thing, after a lifetime of being the signature nobody saw, to be seen once, fully, in the white light, holding my husband's portfolio, by every person who had ever decided I was small. So that is my story. That is what it cost to be invisible, and that is what it was worth when the lights finally found me. If this story touched your heart, if you felt it land somewhere old and tender in you, then I think you are one of the people I made it for. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to sit with it the way I have learned to sit with things, slowly. Have you ever been the quiet one in your own family, the one who gave the most and was thanked the least? And if you have, when the moment finally came, did you choose to be right, or did you choose to be merciful? There is no wrong answer. I have done both in my life, and I can tell you only that one of them lets you sleep. If this story meant something to you, do an old woman a kindness and let me know you were here. Give it a like so that the others who need it can find it, and subscribe to her quiet reckoning so you do not miss the next one. Because there is always a next one. There is always another woman the world counted out who turns out to have been holding the pen all along. And before you go, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Because I like to imagine all of you out there in the dark, in your kitchens and your cars and your quiet rooms, the seen and the unseen, the thanked and the overlooked. All of us together for a little while. I read them, you know. I read the comments the way I read those thank you cards from the nursing students. One at a time, slowly, and I think of each of you as a name in a ledger that is finally, after all these years, being read out loud. So leave your name. Leave your city. Let me know you were here. We are keeping each other company, wherever you are tonight, and whatever they have decided you are worth. I want you to hear an old woman tell you the one thing it took me 64 years and a gold leaf ceiling to finally believe. Your value is not determined by the people who fail to see it. It never was. It never will be. Keep your ledger, give quietly, and ask for nothing, and let your worth be discovered. But do not let them tell you the account is empty, and do not go to your grave with it unread, because a full ledger, kept too long in the dark, will break your heart in the name of your humility. There is a day to read it out loud. When it comes, stand up, walk to the front. And one day, in this life or the next, in a ballroom or a kitchen or a place you have not imagined yet, the lights are going to find you too. Good night, and God keep you, and thank you for sitting with me a while.